Ambassador Jonathan Kincaid was a man of peace, but the lifeless figure sprawled across the cold, metallic floor of his quarters told a different story. His body bore no marks of struggle. His expression, frozen in shock, hinted at the sinister. An eerie stillness hung in the air, punctuated only by the hum of the Galactic Council Station's environmental systems. The discovery was made by one of the station's custodial drones, which promptly summoned Chief Security Officer Tarlon, a member of the Varkial species. Tarlon's imposing frame and reptilian features exuded a mix of authority and danger. His slit-pupiled eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene. Something was wrong. The ambassador's reputation as a cautious, calculating diplomat didn't align with the apparent accident that the preliminary report suggested. But protocol took precedence. "Seal off the area," Tarlon barked to his team. "No one enters or leaves without my approval." Minutes later, Counselor Vector arrived, his presence commanding attention. A member of the Procker, a species known for their sharp intellect and sharper claws, Vector's silver-hued exoskeleton gleamed under the sterile lights. He regarded Kincaid's body with detached interest, as if calculating its political implications rather than mourning the loss. "This is an inconvenience," Vector hissed, his mandibles clicking. "The humans are already suspicious of our motives. This incident will fuel their paranoia." Tarlon straightened. "With respect, Counselor, this isn't an incident. It's a death, under questionable circumstances." "It will remain an incident," Vector replied sharply. "You will ensure it." In the following hours, the council convened in a private chamber. The delegates, a colorful assembly of species with diverse physiologies and agendas, sat in tense silence as Vector addressed them. "We must maintain stability," he began, his voice smooth but authoritative. "Ambassador Kincaid's demise, while regrettable, must not disrupt the delicate balance we've achieved here." Counselor Radok, a stoic Urvik with crystalline skin that refracted light in a mesmerizing display, frowned. "And how do you propose we explain this to the humans? They will demand answers, and they will not settle for a sanitized version of events." "We control the narrative," Vector replied, leaning forward. "We frame this as a tragic accident, one born of human error, perhaps a malfunction in his quarters' environmental systems. We have the means to make it convincing." Radok's expression darkened, his crystalline features dimming. "Deception is a dangerous path, Vector. If we're caught—" "We won't be," Vector interrupted, "as long as we act decisively. The alternative is chaos." The room fell into uneasy agreement. The stakes were too high to risk open conflict with humanity, a burgeoning power in the galactic sphere. Tarlon worked methodically, his reluctance buried beneath a veneer of professionalism. Surveillance logs were altered, showing Kincaid returning to his quarters hours before his death alone. The actual footage, revealing a brief but heated encounter with an unidentified Procker figure, was erased. Forensic teams manipulated environmental data to suggest a failure in the oxygen filtration system, a plausible explanation for Kincaid's death given the station's complex infrastructure. Despite his compliance, Tarlon's unease grew. He knew better than to question Vector openly, but the weight of his actions gnawed at him. In quiet moments, he found himself glancing at Kincaid's face in the falsified records, the human's eyes staring back with an unspoken accusation. Meanwhile, news of Kincaid's death reached Earth. The United Earth government, blindsided by the announcement, immediately demanded an independent investigation. Vector's fabricated reports were sent, but the humans weren't satisfied. Whispers of foul play circulated among their leaders. "They think we're fools," growled Commodore Elias Harker, slamming his fist on the conference table during an emergency meeting on Earth. "Kincaid didn't just drop dead. They're hiding something." President Anthony Steele, a seasoned diplomat himself, nodded grimly. "Agreed. The Galactic Council's version of events is too convenient. We need someone who can cut through the lies and get to the truth." The room fell silent as the weight of the task settled on them. Then, A young aide hesitantly spoke. "There's one man who might be able to handle this," he said. "But he's unconventional." Steele arched an eyebrow. "Who?" "Damian Watson." Back on the Galactic Council station, cracks in the facade began to show. Counselor Raydock, guilt gnawing at him, sought out Tarlon in the quiet of the station's observation deck. The stars outside shone cold and distant, a reminder of the vastness and loneliness of their position. "This cover-up," Raydock began, his voice low. "It will unravel. You know this as well as I." Tarlon didn't respond immediately. His clawed hands gripped the railing as he stared into the void. "It's not my place to question the Council's decisions," he said finally. "And yet you question them," Raydock pressed. "You're not blind, Tarlon. You saw what happened. That was no accident." Tarlon turned to face him, his eyes glinting with frustration. "What do you want me to say, Raydock? That I regret what we're doing? Fine, I do. But regret doesn't change the reality. If I speak out, I'll be silenced. You will too." Raydock's crystalline skin dimmed further, a sign of internal conflict. "Perhaps. But there's a line we cannot cross. When humans discover the truth, and they will, the repercussions will be catastrophic." Tarlon remained silent, his thoughts churning. As the Galactic Council maintained its fragile charade, the humans prepared their response. The arrival of Damian Watson loomed on the horizon, an unyielding force set to collide with the Council's meticulously crafted lies. Unbeknownst to the Council, Kincaid's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was the catalyst for an unraveling that would shake the galaxy to its core. Damian Watson stepped off the transport pod and onto the cold, gleaming floors of the Galactic Council station. He paused for a moment, adjusting the lapels of his dark, travel-worn coat as he surveyed the alien architecture around him. The air smelled sterile, tinged with the faint metallic tang of recycled oxygen. It wasn't his first time on a station like this, but the alien stares, curious, wary, and outright hostile, never ceased to remind him how far humanity still had to go in this vast galaxy. Watson was no stranger to high-stakes investigations, but this one was different. A human ambassador dead, and the official report stank of a cover-up. It wasn't just about justice. It was about sending a message to the galaxy that humanity wouldn't be silenced. He strode forward with purpose, his boots clicking against the floor as he entered the reception hall. A towering figure waited for him, reptilian and bristling with authority. Chief Security Officer Tarlon. "You're late," Tarlon hissed, his sharp teeth glinting in the light. "I prefer to call it dramatic timing," Watson replied, his voice steady and laced with dry humor. He met Tarlon's slit-pupiled gaze without flinching. "You're Tarlon, I presume?" "I am," Tarlon replied, his tone cold. "And you must be Damian Watson, the human's legendary investigator." He said the words with a faint sneer, as if unimpressed. "Legendary's a bit much," Watson said with a faint smile. "Let's stick with thorough. Now, where's the scene?" Tarlon hesitated for a fraction of a second before gesturing toward the lift. "Follow me." The journey to Kincaid's quarters was silent, the tension between the two men palpable. Tarlon's hulking frame dwarfed Watson's lean, wiry build, but Watson exuded a confidence that seemed to even the scales. As they entered the room, Watson immediately noted the sanitized sterility of the scene. "Spotless," Watson remarked, his sharp eyes scanning every surface. "Almost too spotless." Tarlon folded his arms. "It's standard procedure to decontaminate after a death. We've preserved all relevant data." "Relevant according to whom?" Watson countered, kneeling by the spot where Kincaid's body had been found. He produced a small scanner from his coat and ran it over the area. "No residual biosignatures. Either your cleaning crew deserves a medal, or someone went out of their way to erase more than just evidence." Tarlon's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Watson rose, pocketing his scanner. "Let's talk about the timeline." Kincaid was last seen, officially, returning to his quarters. "Any witnesses?" "None," Tarlon said. "The surveillance logs confirm his arrival, and no one entered or exited until his body was discovered. Watson smirked. I'll bet a year's salary those logs are about as real as Vector's charm. Watson spent hours poring over the doctor reports, dissecting them with a precision that unnerved Tarlon. He noticed inconsistencies immediately. Timestamps that didn't align, environmental readings that contradicted the supposed oxygen failure. By the time Watson left the quarters, his expression had hardened. Who ordered the cover-up? He asked bluntly, catching Tarlon off guard. The Varkiel's eyes narrowed. That's a serious accusation. It's not an accusation. It's an observation, Watson replied. You're good at your job, Tarlon. Too good to miss the inconsistencies I just found. Someone leaned on you. For a moment, Tarlon said nothing, his claws flexing at his sides. I have my orders, he finally said. I suggest you focus on your investigation, detective, and leave politics to the council. Watson's smile didn't reach his eyes. Orders don't absolve guilt. They just make it harder to sleep at night. Later, Watson found himself in the council chamber, a cavernous room filled with alien delegates perched on elevated platforms. Counselor Vector presided over the meeting like a spider in its web, his silver exoskeleton gleaming as he addressed the assembly. And what assurances do we have, Vector said, his voice smooth yet cutting, that this human investigator will act impartially? This station is neutral ground. The introduction of Earth's representative jeopardizes that neutrality. Watson, seated in the observer's section, leaned back in his chair and studied the alien. The Procker counselor's polished exterior couldn't hide the calculating predator beneath. President Anthony Steele's voice came through the station's secure communications line, relayed by a holographic avatar. The only thing this investigation jeopardizes, Counselor, is the truth staying buried. Earth won't accept half measures. Watson stood, his movements deliberate as the room fell silent. I'm not here to play diplomat, Counselor Vector, he said. I'm here to find out why Ambassador Kincaid is dead. If your conscience is clean, you have nothing to fear. The ripple of unease across the chamber was almost imperceptible, but Watson caught it. Fear. Someone had something to hide. Returning to his temporary quarters that evening, Watson was greeted by an unexpected visitor. A station janitor, a member of the diminutive Ellerin species, stood nervously by the door. His translucent skin shimmered faintly, reflecting his unease. You're Watson? The janitor whispered, glancing over his shoulder. Watson raised an eyebrow. That's what it says on my ID. Who's asking? The janitor stepped closer, his voice barely audible. You're not safe here. They'll kill you if you get too close. Watson's curiosity piqued. And who are they? The janitor hesitated, his eyes darting nervously. The ones who silenced the ambassador. They're watching everything. Trust no one. Before Watson could press further, the janitor scurried away, leaving Watson alone with his thoughts. Watson stared out of his quarters viewport, the stars beyond shimmering like distant promises. He had only scratched the surface, but already the threads of conspiracy were unraveling. Someone powerful wanted Kincaid dead, and someone else wanted Watson gone. The game had begun, and Damian Watson was ready to play. The Galactic Council Station was a labyrinth of secrets, but Damian Watson had a knack for finding the truth in the most unlikely places. His investigation had barely begun, and already the threads of deception were tightening around him. Every step forward was met with resistance, but Watson wasn't easily deterred. Watson's breakthrough came late one evening in the dimly lit archives. The station's records room, a sprawling maze of data terminals and storage banks, was monitored heavily, but Watson had anticipated that. Using a cloaking device smuggled in by Earth's intelligence agency, he bypassed security protocols and accessed restricted files. As he sifted through fragments of surveillance footage, his sharp eyes caught something odd, a frame out of sync with the fabricated timeline. It showed Ambassador Kincaid in his quarters with another figure, a Procker. The footage was brief, a mere few seconds before it cut to static, but it was enough to tell Watson he was right. Kincaid hadn't been alone before his death. Watson's fingers flew across the console as he reconstructed corrupted data, piecing together a grainy but damning video. The figure's identity was unclear, but their body language spoke volumes. Kincaid had been agitated, gesturing emphatically while the procker loomed over him. "Looks like our ambassador stumbled onto something big," Watson muttered to himself. And someone didn't want him talking about it. The next day, Watson decided to confront Tarlon. The security chief had shown signs of doubt, and Watson needed answers. He found Tarlon in the observation deck, staring out at the endless void of space. "Tarlon," Watson called out, his voice cutting through the silence. The Varkiel turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "Detective, I assume you're here to accuse me of something." "Not yet," Watson replied, stepping closer. "But I found evidence that Kincaid wasn't alone before he died. You're too smart not to know about it. So, who's pulling the strings?" Tarlon's claws flexed at his sides, a nervous tick Watson noted. "You don't understand how things work here, Watson. This station is a powder keg. One wrong move, and the whole galaxy could burn." Watson's voice dropped, cold and measured. "What I understand is that an innocent man was murdered, and you helped cover it up. You can keep protecting your counsel, or you can do the right thing. Your choice." Tarlon hesitated, the internal conflict clear in his eyes. Finally, he sighed. "Meet me in the maintenance sector at 0200. I'll show you something." The maintenance sector was a dark, forgotten part of the station, far from the polished halls of the council chamber. Watson arrived early, his instincts on high alert. He had learned long ago that promises of truth often came with hidden dangers. Tarlon appeared on time, carrying a small data shard in his clawed hand. "This contains the unaltered footage from Kincaid's quarters," he said, his voice low. "You were right. Kincaid discovered a secret alliance between Vector and the Yarless Syndicate. He planned to expose them, but Vector made sure he never got the chance." Watson took the shard, his mind racing. The Yarless Syndicate was a notorious criminal organization with deep roots in galactic politics. If Vector was involved, it meant the corruption went far deeper than a single murder. Before Watson could press further, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the corridor. Tarlon's eyes widened. "They've found us." A group of armed mercenaries emerged from the shadows, their weapons trained on Watson and Tarlon. The leader, a hulking alien with cybernetic enhancements, stepped forward. "Hand over the shard," he growled. Watson's response was immediate. In one fluid motion, he pulled a concealed blaster from his coat and fired, striking the leader's weapon hand. The room erupted into chaos as the mercenaries opened fire. Tarlon fought with feral precision, his claws tearing through one attacker while Watson used the dimly lit environment to his advantage. He ducked behind machinery, taking precise shots that incapacitated his foes without killing them. As the last mercenary fell, Watson turned to Tarlon, who was bleeding from a deep gash on his arm. "You all right?" Tarlon grunted, nodding. "We need to move. If they sent mercenaries, more will follow." Back in Watson's quarters, Tarlon reluctantly allowed Watson to tend to his wound. "I don't know why I'm helping you," Tarlon muttered. "Because you're tired of looking the other way," Watson replied, not looking up from his work. "You've got a conscience, Tarlon. It's just been buried under orders for too long." The Varkiel didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Watson inserted the data shard into his personal terminal, his heart pounding as the unaltered footage played. The video confirmed everything. Kincaid's meeting with Vector, the ambassador's desperate plea for justice, and the Procker counselor's cold, calculated strike. A hidden blade plunging into Kincaid's chest. "Vector didn't just cover this up," Watson said, his voice grim. "He orchestrated it." Tarlon stared at the screen, his usual stoicism cracking. "If this gets out, the council will collapse. The fallout will be catastrophic." "Good," Watson replied, It's time someone held them accountable. As Tarlon left, his allegiance uncertain, Watson sat alone in his quarters, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. He had the truth now, but the question remained, how to use it? Outside his viewport, the stars continued their silent vigil, oblivious to the storm brewing on the Galactic Council station. Watson's path was clear, but it was fraught with danger, and he knew the hardest choices were yet to come. The pieces were in place. The next move was his. The Galactic Council chamber, with its grand vaulted ceilings and walls that shimmered with pulsating light, had seen its share of tense moments, but none like this. Damian Watson stood at its center, a lone figure amid an amphitheater of alien eyes. Counselor Vector perched above him on the central dais, his silver exoskeleton gleaming like a suit of armor, his mandibles clicking softly in anticipation. "You requested an audience," Vector said, his voice smooth and condescending, "though I fail to see what purpose it serves. The investigation is closed, and your time here is nearing its end." Watson met Vector's gaze with calm defiance. "On the contrary, Counselor, my work here has just begun." The murmurs that rippled through the chamber didn't faze Watson. He reached into his coat and pulled out the data shard, holding it up for all to see. "This," Watson began, his voice ringing clear, "is the unaltered truth about the death of Ambassador Kincaid. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that his death was no accident. It was premeditated murder, orchestrated by one of your own." Vector's mandibles flared slightly, a subtle but telling sign of unease. "These are serious allegations, Detective Watson," he said, his tone measured. "If you have evidence, present it." Watson inserted the shard into the council's central hollow projector. The room darkened, and the holographic footage flickered to life. The delegates leaned forward as the scene unfolded. Kincaid's passionate argument, Vector's looming presence, and finally, the cold, efficient strike that ended the ambassador's life. The chamber erupted into chaos. Delegates shouted over one another in a cacophony of languages, their collective outrage filling the room. Vector, however, remained silent, his expression unreadable. "This is a fabrication," Vector declared, his voice rising above the din, a desperate attempt by humanity to destabilize this council and seize power for themselves. Watson stepped forward, his jaw set. "The only one destabilizing this council is you, Vector. You killed Kincaid because he discovered your secret alliance with the Yarless Syndicate. You've used your position to shield criminals, and now you're trying to cover your tracks." Before Vector could respond, Counselor Radok, the crystalline-skinned Ervik, rose from his seat. His voice, calm yet resolute, cut through the noise. "I can corroborate Detective Watson's claims," he said, his crystalline form shimmering with determination. All eyes turned to Radok as he continued. "I have long suspected Counselor Vector of abusing his authority, but I lacked the courage to act. No more. Kincaid sought my counsel shortly before his death. He confided in me about the evidence he uncovered, and I failed to protect him." Radok's admission sent another wave of murmurs through the chamber. Vector's mandibles twitched, and his claws flexed against the edge of the dais. "This is treason," Vector snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "You dare conspire with this human to undermine the council?" "No, Vector," Radok replied evenly. "I dare to uphold the integrity of this council. Something you've forgotten." Vector moved suddenly, a blur of silver and sharp edges. Before anyone could react, he activated a concealed blade in his arm and leapt toward Watson. But Watson was ready. With practiced precision, he sidestepped the attack and drew his weapon, aiming it directly at Vector. "Stand down," Watson said, his voice cold and steady. Vector laughed, a guttural sound that echoed through the chamber. "You think you can stop me? I've manipulated this council for years. You're nothing but an insect in my web." The chamber guards, finally shaken from their shock, surrounded Vector, their weapons trained on him. But the counselor wasn't done. With a swift motion, he activated a device embedded in his exoskeleton. The chamber lights flickered as a signal pulsed through the station. It's too late, Vector hissed. The Syndicate will silence all of you. Watson acted quickly, pulling a small EMP device from his coat. With a press of a button, the device emitted a pulse that disrupted Vector's signal, severing his connection to the Syndicate's network. That's the problem with relying on tech, Watson said, smirking. It's easy to shut down. As the guards restrained Vector, the chamber erupted into cheers and applause. Watson turned to Radok, who approached him with a solemn expression. You've done what many of us lack the courage to do, Radok said. You've exposed a rot that threatens us all. It's not over yet, Watson replied. We need to dismantle the Syndicate's operations and ensure this council learns from its mistakes. Otherwise, Kincaid's sacrifice will mean nothing. In the days that followed, the fallout from Vector's exposure rippled across the galaxy. The Council launched a full investigation into the Yarless Syndicate, with Watson providing critical insights. Tarlon, inspired by Watson's unwavering determination, stepped forward as a key witness, his testimony cementing the case against Vector. As Watson prepared to leave the station, Tarlon approached him at the docking bay. You're leaving already? Tarlon asked. My work here is done, Watson replied, shouldering his bag. The rest is up to you. Tarlon extended a clawed hand, his expression sincere. You've given us a chance to make things right. Don't think we'll waste it. Watson shook his hand, a rare smile tugging at his lips. See that you don't. As Watson's transport pod departed the station, he gazed out at the stars, their light cutting through the darkness like the truth he had fought to uncover. The galaxy was still a dangerous, corrupt place, but Watson knew that change often began with a single spark. And Damian Watson had never been afraid to light a fire.